Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I think we shall start talk with our permission. Thank you all for finding the time, I'm sure from a very busy schedule to be here. By way of background, I just wanted to give a short historical introduction to the Manazil. The book is called Manazil al-Sa'irin, al-Ma'rifa wal-Yaqeen, which in Arabic means the path of the wayfarers towards knowledge and certainty. It's one of the most important books throughout the Sufi tradition of spiritual wayfaring, in the sense that it's designed as a usable manual for people of the time and place to help them along the path, which was a path not only of practice but also a reality. It was a time when, as they say, Sufism was a reality without a name, and now it has become a name without a reality. So it is more to do with the state and the condition of the wayfarer. And the manual, there are a few other manuals like it. Not that many, actually. There are many works of literature that deal with journeying, that is going from one condition, one state, one stage to another in the spiritual path. Of course, the most famous one, I'm sure all of you have heard of, is the epic poem by Attar, The Conference of the Birds, which is in its way a form of spiritual journeying. There's also a number of the early classic works of Sufism which dealt more with the forms and contents, as it were, of the life of the inner world, the life of the adepts, relationship between the adepts themselves, between the adepts and masters, and so on. But this is the first detailed manual. It's like a user's manual. In many ways it has a postmodern feel to it. But in other ways it's also a product of its time and place, and might not translate very well if you use it and follow it verbatim. What's really important, I think, is to take the form in which it appears and try to distill it for a modern audience, knowing that a modern audience is not necessarily has the same peculiarities as an audience of 1,000 years ago. And I think this is really a extremely important point. You cannot read these books or access these books and expect within a matter of days to imbibe all the knowledge and all the circumstances and all the states and stations or stages that they embody. The other aspect of it is more to do with the people, the individuals themselves. These were written at a time we care to call it the pre-modern world, where the certainty of people regarding the realm of the unseen, the certainty of people regarding the subtler realities was much, much greater than it is now. I mean, it's not that the times were better. I'm not a person who says the times were necessarily better then than they are now. In many ways, there is great advantage to the expansion of the quantitative aspects of life, but not certainly at the level of detracting from the qualitative aspects. If you look at the world, the pre-modern world, not only of the Islamic world, but also of all of the universes in which religion and the daily encounter with the unseen was an aspect of daily life. It was not something that was added on or something that was attached to otherwise secular world. So we have to start, when we approach these texts, and try to see what is the purpose behind them and how they can be useful to us. We must also recognize that we are not the same spiritual species as people of pre-modern times. What does that mean? It means that we shouldn't write ourselves off, that we are not able to achieve the recognition of the subtler realities. But it means that we have to work that much more extra. We have to start from not the level of zero, but the level of below that, before that. The way in which these texts are written, and the Manazil is a very clear point, a clear example of that, is they make certain assumptions about the spiritual state and condition of the Wayfarer. And they assume that the Wayfarer's encounter with the sacred, with the divine, whatever you want to call it, was taken for granted. It was not something that was questioned. Now we have to accept that the accumulation of the outer world, the effects of the outer world on our inner condition, has to some extent reduced and shrank the faculties that are able to intuitively or instinctively relate to the unseen. And before we can move into these, into explaining the stages of the Wayfarer, of Khawaja Ansari, I thought it would be best to actually examine ourselves and see whether we are in a condition to be able to launch ourselves on this craft and take advantage and benefit from it. So I will start by maybe presumptuously, but I will start by having my own stage. Now, the Manazil is divided into 10 different stages. Each stage has in it 10 doorways. So in total there are 100 steps. There are, as it were, 100 steps that you have to take in order to reach the height of spiritual awareness and understanding. The first step in the formal work of the Manazil starts with the stage or the door of awakening. But if you read the text, and inshallah we'll come to the point where I'll try to explain it, you'll find that it makes certain assumptions which are really very, very far advanced to a contemporary audience. And before we can assume that, or presume to take advantage of what has been outlined to us by this great master, I think it's useful for us to see if we are in fact prepared for this journey. So my pre-stage, as it were, I called it the pre-stage of stirrings, or the very, very preliminaries. And I circulated a note to Agha Mustafa, I think he passed it on to people, is that the purpose of these early stirrings is to establish whether we are able to genuinely, consciously and honestly resonate with the unseen. These stirrings are necessary in order to develop in us the capacity to know that we are entering into a realm that is not subject to quantitative measurement and to quantitative criteria, but requires that we have the qualitative aspects embedded in us. And the first door of these pre-stirrings, I call it the door of agitation. Now, most of these, this is really, I would say, it's based on my own particular pathway or passage to understanding the reality of the unseen. So agitation is the first door. It is, I call it a disturbance that troubles one. It's the sense that comes when a person feels that the outer world, the world of measurement, the world of observation, in itself is insufficient to describe reality. It creates an inner sense of disquiet, imbalance, a disproportion. And it is this agitation that is, I think, the first step in which a person, he or she, knows that there is something beyond the material. There's no point just talking about it. There's no point just talking about the world of the unseen. You actually have to be experientially related to it. Agitation can be triggered by anything. It can be triggered by one sitting in the number 9 bus, or it can be triggered by a person who a terrible event has happened, or on the contrary, a wonderful event has happened. It's a disturbance, a tingling. For those who are more inclined to reflection and interaction, it can be a product of continuing reflection. But what it does, it tells you that there is something beyond sight, sound, feeling, touching, beyond the psyche, beyond the mind, beyond the realm of the physical and the psychological. I mention the psychological because the psychological is also a measure, a mental measure of the outer world. So it is quantitative rather than a subtle reality. So this agitation in which a person's inner faculties, entirely different from the outer faculties, suddenly come to life, or you are aware of them, that there's something out there that you have to cultivate to be able to relate to the unseen, is the agitation. And it has 2 outcomes, I believe. This disturbance can be what I call outer agitation. So it leads you to try to accumulate knowledge and information from the outer world. And this is the automatic reflex of people who have been immersed in the world of materia, the quantitative world. They think that by reading more, that by reading the experiences of others, that by delving into books and texts and meeting people and so on, they will be able to quench this agitation. But this is an outer agitation. It's ultimately to do with the expanding knowledge as it relates to the outer world, hoping that this expansion will somehow awaken your own inner faculties. Inner agitation, on the other hand, is the agitation for the qualitative knowledge that you sense you have inside you. But both forms of agitation require that they be quenched. It's a kind of constant sense of tingling, a sense of imbalance. You need to either read more about it, find out more about it, meet people who know more about it, talk to people who have been there. And when you start from a very low base. But in both cases, both inner agitation and outer agitation, the impulse is to quench it. And without this agitation, I don't think one can begin even. The knowledge of the unseen becomes theoretical, becomes inherited, becomes something that you hope to feel or experience through repetition, but it will never happen. Next door, for those who want to continue, you can always give up and just say, well, go back to outer life and deny that there is any truth in these faculties. But if you want to move on, you move through the door of what I call perplexity. And the door of perplexity is the recognition that outer knowledge is deficient, is insufficient, and inadequate. And it is really a puzzlement because you know that the outer knowledge is insufficient to manage your relationship with the unseen. But at the same time, you know that you have not yet recognized the mechanisms within you that allow you to question the dominance of the outer senses. You have spent your life measuring things, thinking about things, rationalizing things, assessing things, weighing things, feeling things. And these are the faculties that you know. So, if these faculties cannot resonate with the agitation, or the agitation is not quenched by these faculties, you become perplexed. Why is this continuing? Why can't it be quenched by reason? Why can't it be quenched by repetition? Why can't it be quenched by observance of certain rituals or certain? So, perplexity arises when you know that there is this unaccustomed light inside you, unaccustomed light of faculties that you have been laying dormant for so long. They clash with conventional perceptions. Now this, I think, is the most dangerous state for people who have begun to sense the unseen, because it's a very fragile state. And it can be easily smothered. Because you don't know how to deal with it. And the easiest way to deal with it is to rationalize it, or to try to encapsulate it, or to categorize it in ways that you can understand. So, and if you don't deal with it appropriately, it can veer into something quite, I think, poor for the passage of the spiritual wayfarer, and that is what I call sentimentality and spiritualism, occultism is part of the dead end to which perplexity can reach. So perplexity, or hira, as we say in Arabic, is both expansive and contractive. Expansive perplexity is the one that recognizes that there's a new world out there to be discovered, and you want to discover it. And you want to go through the struggle of discovering it. Contractive perplexity, which is another possible outcome, is in fact a retreat, a withdrawal. And it's a withdrawal where you end up questioning the certitude that comes from your outer senses, but not really knowing what to do about it. And you pull back. You don't try to go to the next step. You're satisfied with, I have these faculties, I don't know where they are, why they're there, I have no idea how to evolve them or to develop them, but I will keep them. I will recognize them. And they are sort of in reserve against a very unidimensional perspective on truth. But both expansive perplexity and contractive perplexity are pathways, I think, valid pathways for the spiritual wanderer. And here I'm calling the person who has reached that point a wanderer, because you're wandering as it were in a dark room, driven by agitation, not really knowing what senses to use to quench this agitation. Perplexity, then, if you move on, the next stage, I think, is, I call it the door of awareness. These might be all very sort of modular ways of looking at it, and they don't necessarily follow in this order. I think they should follow in this order because I have experience of them, but in others it might be slightly different here and there. But let's say the third door is the doorway of awareness. And awareness is basically a recognition and a confirmation that you have subtle realities inside you. It is the first step in which your knowledge of yourself begins to become more refined. The self begins to assume sort of a rainbow shape. It has different hues to it, and different colors to it, and different states and conditions to it. And this, I believe, is a form of verification. This awareness verifies to you that there is a higher reality and purpose to existence. Again, there are two forms of awareness. There's active awareness, in which a person journeys on the discovery of the inner faculties of knowledge, trying to understand what they are, who they are, why they are, what are their functions, what are their capabilities, and what are they there for. Passive awareness is just to accept that these faculties exist, that there is another dimension of knowledge, but you don't have the desire to map out the contours. So you just stop at that point. Awareness then leads to inquiry. You want to inquire. There's a desire to investigate the contours of this awareness. It is to verify the source and nature of awareness. And it is affected by listening, exchanging, observing, and reflecting. And you end up verifying it, verifying the knowledge and experience of others. When your inquiry leads to people, to individuals who have been there and have obviously risen in terms of their spiritual understanding and awareness, you use them to verify your inquiry. That's the outer form of inquiry. The inner form of inquiry is to verify the knowledge in the heart of the experiences of the self. So you start using different measures, different measurements. Both levels of inquiry, that is, trying to find the right vehicle, the right venue, the right person to confirm the contours of this awareness. And inner knowledge, inner awareness, inner inquiry are necessary for the wayfarer. Inquiry of the mind, I say, without the heart is a barren knowledge. And inquiry of the heart without the mind is a formless knowledge. So they both are necessary to formulate the contours of the faculties of inner knowledge that allows you to understand the unseen. Then you move on to the other door, next door, which is, I call it the door of guidance. And here each one of us, I think, has in his or her mind the guide. It can be a physical guide, a guide whom you know, resonate with, exchange with, can see. Or it can be an unseen guide. I don't want to remove that possibility. These days, most guides, or the vast majority of people who are chosen as guides, are masters, realized masters of the path. A lot of people who are not, who pose themselves as guides, but in reality do not have the substance of guidance. But the knowledge of the guide is necessary when you reach the door of seeking guidance. And it is basically an acknowledgement that you yourself are deficient in understanding where these contours of awareness lie within you, where they're going and how you will use them to get there. And without that guide, the terrain of the spiritual wanderer, which is what you have become by then, having reached that fifth door, is really becomes a wilderness full of all kinds of pitfalls, all kinds of perils, and mirages, and shadowy states and conditions. Without the guide to be able to tell you that this is a correct encounter, this is an incorrect understanding, this is the right way, avoid this, beware of that, do this. The terrain for a lone spiritual wanderer is very, very fraught with perils. The guide that you may have at this stage, I'd like to say, is not necessarily the same guide that you would have when you're more advanced spiritually. You're still at the stage of wandering. You're still at the stage of trying to discover the sacred. The guide here does not have to be a great master, a great being. It can be a person who has gone through that and maybe has not necessarily veered towards improving his or her spiritual status, but has enough knowledge of the terrain to impart with that knowledge to you. So the guides there can be teachers, they can be friends, they can be counselors, they can be anybody who has these attributes that allows you to move on this path. This path, I would like to remind you, is not yet the first path, first stage of the Manazil. The door of guidance also has pitfalls, very serious ones, because you have to differentiate between true and false guidance. True guidance leads the wanderer along the path of arousing these latent faculties and can unite the two levels of inquiry, outer inquiry and inner inquiry. And true guidance allows the soul, the self, to focus on the soul reality with a capital R that stands behind all realities. False guidance leads the wanderer to focus on the guide. And I think this is a very important measure that you have to use to differentiate between the two. Any guide who points to himself or herself rather than leads you to one reality is a false guide. And one has to be very careful and avoid that. The next door is a door that many people flee from, because I call it door of selection. And here the wanderer has to basically commit to a formal spiritual path. Now, all formal, authentic spiritual paths start and end in the same point. There's a lot of stuff in between, which you may or may not accept, which you may or may not acknowledge, which you may or may not find useful. But the humanity has been at this since the dawn of intellect and consciousness, and this is not something that is new. And there are formal schools. Some we call religions, some we call paths. But you need to commit to a structure, mainly because you need to bind yourself. You need to constrain yourself as you move along. And the selection of the schools or of the pathways ultimately must relate to the original unfolding of the spiritual path to human beings, or what one would call the primordial, the original contract between created entities and their creator. Now, the path that I'm on, and that I assume most or some of you on, is the path of Islam. But it can be any other path that has the same discipline and has the same beginning and end, beginning in the one and ending in the one. But the doorway has to be the confirmation of the existence of the primordial religion, the Deen al-Hanif, and that the selection of your stream that you're going to choose, because with that selection comes discipline. Religions are above all a spiritual discipline. Requires that you abide by the byways of this discipline. So, selection of the pathway is a method, a program, and a consciousness. Now, the consciousness of one path is not necessarily the same as the other, but there's no point dabbling in your own way, because dabbling in this, that, or the other, it's not like a smorgasbord. You have to select one and recognize that these disciplines and constraints that are embedded in that path are necessary to allow you to unchain yourself in the inner world by binding yourself, constraining yourself in the outer world. So these talks will be related to the path of Deen al-Hanif, the primordial religion, and it is the pathway of prophets and messengers, and it's the pathway of Islam. But as I said, it can be another pathway if you so choose, but you have to stick to the discipline of that pathway. The inner dimension of all the pathways, all the authentic pathways are the same. There has been very little doubt about that. As you go up the hierarchy of spiritual realization, the differences begin to melt. But they nevertheless are real at the point where you enter them. So, if one thinks that one can do bits and pieces here and combine, and it will not work, and it has not worked. It ultimately leads to the choice, the need to select a discipline. And once you select that discipline, you have to persevere in it. You have to persevere in launching your craft on the stream. Now, this stream that you have will meet other streams later on as they return back to the reality of the one. But you can't jump from one stream to the next. I mean, you can, but you have to change your craft if you want to do that. You cannot expect your craft, your boat that you launch yourself on, the spiritual path, can be useful in all streams. So when you start, the requirements are very, very simple at the early stages. The discipline required is basically to accept that there is a discipline, not necessarily to submit to the discipline, but to accept that there's a discipline. So when you persevere in the outer realm, it is basically to abide by the rules of spiritual navigation. And when you persevere in the inner realm, you maintain a state of preparedness for the inevitable openings that will arise. Once you have started on a path, selected a path, and persevered in it, you need companions. There's no doubt about that. And companionship is the ingathering of like-minded, like-hearted spiritual wanderers. And it reinforces and amplifies the steadfastness of people. And it makes the whole process more agreeable and more simple. It lightens your burdens and smooths the pathway. And companionship is also a reflection, because you reflect yourself onto the other person. And it is the other person also that the other person's reflection on yourself enhances your understanding. And where the higher qualities are there in companionship of trust, loyalty, sincerity, the mirror of companionship reflects well. And where the lesser qualities, even vices are there, suspicion, doubt, pride, the mirror of companionship does not reflect at all. So my motto is to choose your companions as you choose all that is most valuable to you. Then from companionship, discipline, perseverance, inquiry, and so on, you develop the inner sight, the door of inner sight, not insight, but inner sight opens to you. And inner sight is really just the verification of the existence and the reality of your inner senses, of your inner faculties. And from this inner sight comes insight. There are a huge number of definitions, explanations, elaborations on what is this inner sight, what's it composed of. I mean, this is time for another talk, it's not time for it, but there are a number of works that describe the components of inner sight. There are things like reflection, remembrance, attributing value to things. But this is, as I said, these are mainly classifications of this assembly of faculties that suddenly emerges. And with inner sight, you begin to ascribe value to things. You begin to recognize meaning. And with inner sight, you lay to rest, finally, the preponderance of the material over the subtle, the preponderance of quantity over quality. It doesn't mean you substitute them entirely. With inner sight, the subtler realities emerge, and they begin to balance the outer sight. And it is balance that we are seeking. You cannot smother quantity with quality. It's very difficult to do it anyway. But you need both. But what we have is a preponderance of one over the other, or a complete smothering of one over the other. And the whole point about this original, this the preliminary stirrings is to rebalance this thing. Once this is done, you become a traveler and not a wanderer anymore. You know where you're going. You're not wandering around. And the wanderer ceases to be a wanderer and becomes instead a seeker. And the goal becomes clear. You have started off your pre-journey with these agitations, the stirrings of agitation, and it's replaced at the end of the journey by the decisiveness of journeying towards your desired goal. So you are now fit, or one is fit, to pass from the stage of stirrings to the stage of bidayat, or beginnings. And you now have the faculties inside of you. So the lower self, the commanding self, that was the only expression of the self, of this rainbow self, at the beginning of at the time when agitation first struck you, has changed its nature, has moved to being an inspired self. And the inspired self is necessary for the seeker to cease being a wanderer and to become a traveler. And the inspired self moves you to the beginnings. So I shall now move from my elaborations to what Sheikh Ansari talks about, which is the stage of the beginnings, the bidayat, as he calls it. Ansari lived in Herat, which is in modern day Afghanistan. In those days it was part of this greater Khorasan area, part of the Persianate world. For a person who has such subtle instincts and insights, he was also a very much a rigorous and in many ways dry scholar of the outer world. So he balanced this dryness with this sort of ecstatic state. He wrote mainly in Persian. He has some wonderful poems and exhortations, munajat they're called in Farsi. But this book is written in Arabic, the stages, the Manazil, the stages of the Wayfarer. The first stage of Ansari's Manazil is the stage of the beginnings. Now I have tried to make them more user-friendly by changing the wording, the text and so on, but while maintaining hopefully the content. And they do not necessarily, as I said, we should not necessarily think of them in very structured hierarchical forms. But there is a structure and there is a hierarchy, but not in the rigid sense of the pre-modern writers. Ansari's first stage, the beginning of the beginning, as it were, is the door of awakening, yaqwa. Now, it's not the door of awareness. Awareness is the door that opens when you're beginning to rediscover the spiritual faculties. Awakening is when you have already recognized them. It is literally like a person who's been asleep, and you wake. The first onrush of being awakened is what the spiritual wanderer experiences. He starts with all of these doors by an appropriate Quranic verse, and the one he starts with, the door of awakening, is I translate from using Tarif Khalidi's translation. I offer you a single counsel. Draw close to God in twos and ones, and then reflect. I will use the word God, Allah, truth, reality interchangeably, so some of these terms might change. And he says that awakening is to arise from a condition of absent-mindedness and heedlessness. And it's the first stage of enlivening the heart by the rays of awareness. Awakening manifests itself by seeing the bounties that you have with your inner eye and despairing from counting them. You begin to see the world from its inner realities, and what was a condition of maybe outer constraints of conditions of restrictiveness. You see them with the inner sight as one of bounties, of na'am, and you despair from counting them, and you recognize that their bestower is not humanity, is not mankind. Their bestower lies elsewhere. The knowledge that bounties are infinite and that you are the recipient of these bounties comes from the light of inspired reason, spiritually recharged. The spark of inspiration and the example of those guides and others who have been transported to these realms beforehand. It's not so much count your blessings type of condition, but is recognizing that all of reality, all of the manifestations of everything are in a form of bounty, and the source of them lies outside of human beings. Awakening also requires that you recognize that you can slip out of it, and that you can fall into states and conditions where you go back to sleep again. And to avoid that, you have to constantly remind yourself of the bestower, the truth, and you have to know that yourself, when it is awakened, begins to recognize that behind all of the manifestations of all kinds of realities lies only one. And very, very importantly, to stay awake, to be awakened, and to use that as a platform to move on to the next door, the next stage, you have to be willing to break habits. This is really an essential element in any spiritual wandering, spiritual wayfaring. You have to break habits. You have to get out of your comfort zone. And these habits can be anything. It can be habits of the way that you sleep, the way that you eat, the way that you do your devotions, the way that you study. Anything which gives you a comfort zone that is false needs to be broken. And it does wonders. Breaking habits that are constrictive, that are restrictive to the spiritual path, are an essential requirement for awakening. Once the wanderer has become a traveler, and the traveler has become a wayfarer, after the awakening comes recognition that you have erred in the way that you have conducted yourself, the way that you have lived in the past. And as the Quran says, and those who are unrepentant are surely the oppressors. That is, they oppress themselves by not recognizing the error of their ways. But you can't really seek redress for error unless you know what you have transgressed. What are the transgressions that you have done? And this becomes a reality. The categorizations of transgressions that require you to recognize them and to rectify them and resolve not to repeat them is by really knowing that the reality, or the one, is in a state of constant interchange and exchange with the created being. And when a person becomes truly regretful and remorseful regarding the transgression towards oneself and towards others, there's also the fear or the possibility that there is regression, that you might go back to committing these errors. And that is absolutely why the knowledge of your inner realities that allows you to deal with these errors becomes really vital. And when you know that forgiveness is bestowed you know that this is simply the manifestation of the name of the All-Forgiver, the attributes of the Creator, being the All-Forgiver and the All-Just. Forgiveness is necessary because Allah, God, is the All-Forgiver and He is the All-Just. So when you seek redress from the path of error, you're in fact using that redress to better understand the divine names and attributes. And there is, in the final analysis, no arbiter between you and the error except the arbiter. From the door of recognizing error, you move to the door of inner accountability or muhasabah. And Shaykh Ansari quotes, "O those who are secure in their knowledge, fear God, and let each self consider what it has laid in stock for the morrow." The pathway of accountability of muhasabah is to measure, basically. What is your measure of inner accountability? It's to measure the huge chasm that exists between the infinite gifts of the Creator, of God, of the truth, and your transgressions. This is the measure of the accountability. And for that, for you to have appropriate and proper accountability, there has to be a degree of wisdom, as it were, inner wisdom. And you have to also know the tricky ways of your lower self, so that it recognizes, the self always recognizes that your transgressions are real, because the bounties are infinite. The bounties are infinite, and if you're not in constant thankfulness for being within the reality of these bounties, then transgression is really becomes a matter of course. And you must also recognize and confirm in the state of accountability that bounties do not come from human beings. That whatever you receive in goodness comes from reality, from the truth, from Allah. It may be manifested through individuals, through societies, but its source is one. From accountability, you move to the next door, the fourth door in the stage of beginnings, which is the door of deputization or inaba. And deputization is to basically refer your entire affair, your outer affair and your inner affair, back to God, back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And deputizing your affairs is a higher station than seeking redress for errors. Because when you seek redress for errors, you move really from defiance, from being in a state of defiance by maintaining your errors, to a state of concurrence. But this also requires that you act through yourself. But if you refer the entire affair to a higher authority, then the act of removing errors becomes subsumed under the deputization to Allah, to the higher authority. In the act of deputization, or referring these matters to your spiritual condition, your passage, even your outer affairs, to a higher authority, it removes the self from thinking or from believing that it is somehow independent, that it is able to do things and to achieve things and to realize things through independent action. Independent action is in many ways a mirage. And by deputizing your affairs to higher authority, you realize that the outcomes are not due to your actions. You act at a point in time, but the way that outcomes manifest themselves are outside of your control. And so if you've already deputized the outcomes to a higher authority, then your action must be then error-free. The next door that he talks about is the door of reflection, or tafakkur as he called it. He defines reflection as the recourse to inner sight in order for you to become aware of what you truly desire. You may think that you truly desire, wealth or prestige or something to do with the outer. But your inner desires, if they are on the path of spiritual traveling, cannot have the same measure as the outer quantitative desires. So inner sight that is agitated or moved by reflection makes you aware of what is it that you truly value, truly desire. And reflection is also, for reflection to become a true measure of knowing what is it that you want, what is it that you desire in the inner world. It requires that you reflect also on the nature of oneness, on the nature of reality. And this is necessary for the person to overcome the disturbances that will always be there to deflect a person from the path, to create false turns, missteps. If you reflect on any condition or any end, and you reflect it with the principle of the one, of Tawheed, of oneness behind you, then whatever disturbances come, whatever agitations come, whatever pitfalls and traps and so on, once you refer them to the one, the path becomes smooth. It is no longer subject to being deflected or being waylaid, as it were, on your journey. And reflection, of course, requires that you reflect on the subtleties of creation, the linkages between them, the linkages between all manifest and unmanifest states and conditions, and how they all link to each other, and how they all interrelate to each other, and how they all amplify each other, and how they all add to each other. And that in their totality, they all point to one. The appropriate end of reflection is to see the interconnectedness of things. This is my commentary on this state. It is to see the interconnectedness of things behind which stands one reality. It is also to know that the outer faculties in themselves have limitations that make them impossible to establish the subtle interlinkages that exist between seen and unseen, between various hierarchies of beings and creation. And reflection of this kind begins to hone your qualities, your inner qualities. It's as if you're polishing them or sharpening them, putting an edge to them, so that you can see and recognize signs of realities, inner realities, unseen realities, higher realities, in all kinds of places. They begin to crystallize in, I would say in real form, but they become in themselves a reality. And reflection is really a very, very important state to pass through on the travels of the Wayfarer. From reflection, you go to the door of remembrance. And here, Sheikh Ansari says, remembrance is higher than reflection as a state. Rather than you remember, then you reflect, you have to reflect, then you remember. And the reason is that reflection is to seek what is lost to you. You reflect on something because you're trying to extract from it something, trying to take from it something. While remembrance is to find what is already there. So when you remember something, if you look at it in the outer world, you remember something, you draw on your memory bank, it's there. is sitting there. But when you reflect on something, you're not sure exactly what you're looking for. You reflect on an issue or an event or a condition, but you are trying to find it. Remember, it's already there. Dhikr or tadakkur becomes much facilitated if you have a guide. Now the guide that we're talking about now is different from the guide. This is the spiritual guide. This is the shuyukh or the realized beings that you believe can be or are the necessary aids and assistance on your passage. And remembrance, apart from having the guide to focus and to establish the forms of your remembrance, also benefits from the experiences of other people and from the fruits of your own reflection. Your own personal experiences become, I think, an important element in remembrances, but they have to be seen now in a different context. You don't remember what you did in university in 19 whatever it is, or 20 whatever it is, or you remember this incident or that event, and thereby try to recreate, as it were, in the physical world or in the psychological world, your state at that point. You remember things in relationship to a much deeper base, the base of how they all link to the one. You remember things if they enhance your awareness and knowledge of higher realities. So remembrance as a conscious spiritual effort for the Wayfarer has a different objective than, as it were, regurgitating in ethereal forms your physical or psychological experiences of the past. And here, I think, when you choose the guide that helps you in your spiritual path, the guide is of benefit actually only when you recognize his or her utility by their absence. I mean, I miss Sheikh Abdulla now, but we have Sheikh Hassan here, so this is a wonderful acknowledgement of the veracity of guidance. I'm sure those of you with Sheikh Kabir would also like to. His or her usefulness is manifested or becomes more real as you sense the gap that exists by their absence. From tadakkur, from remembrance, we move to the door of steadfastness. And again, quoting from the Quran, and hold fast, all of you, to the rope of God, and do not fall into dissension. And holding fast is a form of commitment to the contours of the pathway, the spiritual pathway that you have selected, and vigilance in meeting its commands. So this is actually the spiritual confirmation of my earlier door of selection. You have to not only confirm the veracity of the pathway and its promises of openings and consequences, but you also have to bind yourself, as it were, commit yourself, that you would only be bound by the commands of higher authorities, and that you begin to see existence or creation through the prism of, not through the eye of the Creator, but through the prism through which creation is manifested. And this will lead you to seeing only truth, the capital T, the Haqq. And it allows you to basically yield to the reality the power of this reality and pushes you to bring yourself nearer to the source of that power. That is, in fact, what holding onto the rope of God means. You want to be near to the source of power, the engine, as it were, that moves and that enlivens and enlightens the world. The next door is the door of abandonment, or the word in Arabic is firar. It can also mean fleeing. And quoting from the Quran, it says, and flee to God. That is, you flee creation and its false demands and false claims on you to the Creator. So Sheikh Ansari says abandonment is to flee from what never was to what is always present. And here you flee from what is illusory, what is ephemeral, what is transient, what is transitional, what is impermanent, to its opposite, to what is permanent, what is real, to what is everlasting. You move from ignorance to knowledge. You flee from ignorance to knowledge. You flee from lassitude to fortitude. You flee from constriction to expansiveness. And you move from actually hearing about things to witnessing them and experiencing them. Again, we come to this metaphor of you are told about a fire, and then you see the fire, and then you feel the fire, and then you're actually in the fire. There are different states and different conditions, and you flee from hearing about things, from hearing about conditions and states, to actually witnessing them, to being in them, from experimentation to realization, from the form of things to their content and their inner meaning. And the abandonment of those who are most advanced on this path is from what is really not real to the only reality. And then to top it all, you flee from fleeing. You don't need to flee anymore. You move on. It becomes something that you pass through and move beyond that. The next to last door is the door of spiritual exercises. Now we understand them to mean prayers, dhikrs, collective remembrance, recitations. But he defines them as spiritual exercises are the training of the self to accept truthfulness. And truthfulness here, that is the true reality that underlies all manifestations. And that's the point of these exercises. That's the point of all of these outer and inner spiritual exercises. It is to train the self to see only what is true and to discard what is not. And that leads to a person becoming accustomed, becoming intuitively attuned to truthfulness through one's speech, through actions and intentions. And you become reconciled to even the most unpleasant things, that in them there is a certain truth and a certain reality. The various kinds of spiritual exercises with different objectives and different purposes. For the person on the starting stages is to groom oneself, and also one's manner, conduct, ethics, and basically through knowledge, and to purify your actions by acting sincerely and to appropriately account for the rights that others have over you. For those who are higher on the ladder, as it were, of spiritual awareness, is to you transcend seeing. You only see one. You transcend seeing diversity. You only see the diversity and the multiplicity that exists only in reference to their ingathering by and into the one. And you would not entertain any obstacles or deviations or ways in which you are deflected from this knowledge. The last station of the last door of the first stage of the beginnings is he calls the door of audition. Now, the word in Arabic is sama. It is not so much the door of, audition might be the kind of chants that one does, spiritual chants that one does. This is not what I think is meant here. It is the resonating with the sound that originates from the divine, as it were. The primordial sound that came out of nothing and commanded things to be. That is the audition. That is the sound sense that you need to have. One needs to have in this stage of the spiritual wayfarer. It is to understand sound in its primordial sense, in its creative sense, as being one of the first manifestations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is by sound. There was a sound and there was a response to that sound. And Allah names himself as Al-Sami', that is the all-listener. So to listen, a sound has to originate. So the first act of creation was not bringing matter into being or bringing the ideals, the principles into reality, but it was a sound that came from the command be, the sound that came from the crack that opened, out of which existence emerged. So this is the sound that I believe that Ansari talks about. That is, this is the door of. It is like the primordial cry, recognizing the primordial cry, and its echoes in creation, and that the echoes of the cry is in fact existence, and it helps the wayfarer to erase the traces of all that is mundane, all that is transient, in interpreting the truth behind all manifestations. He says it connects the eternal with the everlasting, and sound brought things into being, and sound draws back being into the bosom of the Creator. These are the 10 stages of the stage of the beginnings. Now, they all seem to be a great, I won't say a mouthful, but each one of them requires in itself, I think, a great deal of pondering and reflection. I think that for this to be useful to people other than just sort of academic or scholarly discourse, it's useful to try to relate them to your own personal experiences and see, in fact, where you stand in this hierarchy, where you stand in this medley of doors. All these doors have opened. Where are you really? Are you really at the stage of the stirrings? Are you really at the stage where this is, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you're beyond these stages? I don't know. I mean, each person has to assess his or her true condition, and you have to be true to yourself. If you're not true to yourself, all this is useless, frankly. It becomes just this is not like a spiritual Berlitz course in learning a language or something. This is something that has to be measured carefully. How do you use that? What use is it? I think that it is the way that I've tried to encapsulate it. In fact, it is. I have not cut back anything of consequence. I've put some of the words in more contemporary fashion. But you have to ask yourself, if you're, for example, at the door of awakening, or you're now at the door of deputization, and so on, what do you need to do to yourself in order for you to be established in one of these conditions? You may be in a different condition that I or Ansari has not mentioned or has not noted. This might be something that you can ascertain. But this is very important if you're going to persevere in this. You can drop out. People do drop out. Most people drop out. It goes to a certain point and they become exhausted by it. Or it's so easy that they just want to move on and on and on. We're now in door 10. There are 90 other doors to come. So you can imagine the effort that you need to do if you want to continue with this. But I think it is really very, very important. And for those who want to use it as a tool to help them in their pathway, I believe it's a very good instrument. But Sheikh Hassan knows more, so I'll stop at this point. If you want to take a break, or questions, or issues, or comments, observations.
How you plan out the discourse will go, and something about active participation, or how it will just pan out.
Well, I wanted to give you here sort of a feeling for it, a taste for it. The next ones, I think, will be more interactive. I think this is maybe not the right form, the right structure to do it. I mean, it's more like a person teaching rather than so. I don't mean that. I think, but it requires also that people engage with it. So, if one has ideas, I mean, I'll bring my own ideas as to how to manifest this in either practice, questions and answers, or by making them more sort of user-friendly rather than just listings. But I'm willing to hear and listen to whatever people.
You need to create kind of trust, and because we will be engaged with the material, that's the way we see it.
Yes, if people want to share with others the conditions, but obviously you have to stay somehow within the forms of the Manazil. That would be wonderful, because anything that relates to experience is much more useful than reading about something or talking about it. But again, it depends on the comfort that people have with that. Please come and let's say.
It's very exhausting journey when you think of the 100 odd steps, and to have some sort of help to go from one stage to another. It's really fiddle with Allah from one stage to another all the time, and to have help on this. I think if one assigns one of the divine names to each step and use that as a vehicle to run away from one stage to another, using these lovely, beautiful, divine names, and I think that enhances the whole journey, that you know one thing, that you are looking for one thing is to look for the face of Allah, to look for Allah in every aspect. And I think this might help if we relate to the divine names to help us to go through all these stages.
No, Shaykh, I agree with you. In fact, I wanted to call the stage of the beginnings under the divine name Al-Muhyi. Yes, I wanted to do that, but this is the introduction. So, if there is a consensus or an opinion that this should be done, I will certainly do that. You're absolutely right, Sheikh. I think each of these stages comes under, I think, a kind of commanding name. And the name Muhyi, that is the life giver, which is the awakener in you. But the setting it out as a hierarchy can be, I think, of use to people who think in some structured terms or who want to position themselves, as it were. My only word of caution is that this hierarchy is not cast in concrete. It should be a very flexible hierarchy. Things can go in and out and so on. But the key is to basically know yourself, know where you stand in all of this. And if you feel that you have gone through the door of the beginning, you have a consciousness of the unseen, then these things might be useful aids, I think, but I think you're absolutely right. Each one of the stages has to be under some kind of commanding order, commanding name.
Something about discernment, because I feel like I resonated with a lot of what you said there on something within all of the doors. I also feel like I'm scattered across those on some level as well. I'm wondering whether I can actually trust my inner discernment. Is it the correct discernment? Is the nature of that spiritual discernment is the nature, the truth of that discernment, is it unquestionable when you're faced with it? Or the fact that I feel like I have some discernment but so much doubt, is that evidence that it's not genuine discernment? That's what I'm trying to say. Do you understand?
I understand that. This is something that recurs all the time. But the fact that you're asking a question means that you're agitated. Agitated, I don't mean agitated in a good sense. The sense that you are disturbed by a recognition that maybe this is your intellect doesn't give you the totality. But what you're having now is a kind of reversal of that. Your intellect is trying to trip you by raising these issues. The question is not to accede to the battleground that reason chooses, because lower self will always try to drag you to its level, and this level is the level of causality and level of rationality. But you are, something in you is telling you that this is insufficient. So you have to lay that aside and move on. Now, how true are these signals coming back to you is why you should try to position yourself in this. Because at each stage, if you recognize, if your agitation leads to awareness, that there are inner faculties there that have the capability of discerning truth, then you move on that path. Now there's always a pitfall, especially at the stage of, you now probably, I don't want to categorize people, but it seems there's perplexity here. Yes. So this is something that can be defined and can be treated. You can either stop there and be perplexed, not knowing. And many people are like that. There is a state that is not in itself unwelcome. Or you can move on. Just the act of the volition of moving on brings you to another platform, which your rational faculties then begin to recognize that you're serious in this game, and that you don't want to sort of accede to it and say, I don't know, and move on. So I think in many ways your perplexity will open the door to the next stage. Yes, well, you can
discuss at any point the will, because you mentioned the volition. I'm still feeling perplexed about the will, and you said the independence, and I really would like to go into that a bit. I don't know whether discuss it in the living stage. Because it seems to me
It has 90 other doors, so I'm sure one of them is the door of spiritual will.
very vital thing. Because Khawaja mentions in his course
Yes.
that the will can overcome all sorts of disadvantages. Like, my mother and father didn't abandon me and all that stuff. The will can overcome that, but that will is not totally independent. I want to know more.
I think this is, I understand what you're saying, Khadija Khan, but this is a different realm. I mean, the presence of will that forces you, as it were, to push through all these obstacles. Here, this is more like states and conditions. Now, is will necessary to move from one to the other? Of course, will is necessary. I mean, any step doesn't necessarily, any of these stages, any of these doorways, doesn't lead to the next door. You can stop at this point. It depends on on the attractive power that's drawing you. Yes. No, there has to be a power that draws you. And there's a power, of course, that repels you, which is what our friend just said. There's the power of reason or intellect and so on pushes you away from it. But you have to countervail that, as it were. And that is I said, there are two different kinds of wills. The spiritual will is the one that moves on to the next door. So at each point where you end where you've reached a landing zone, as it were, you have to decide whether you want to stay there or whether you want to move on. So that the force that moves you from one to the next is will. But it can be a will that is subservient and drawn, rather than a will that is active, that pushes.
Because it all comes from him anyway.
Yes, both. But the attractive power, the will as an attractive power, the will of the one is greater than your will. So the will that pulls you up to the next.
You have to let yourself be pulled.
If that will manifests, the attractive will manifests itself. If the repulsing will manifests itself, or the quiescent will manifests itself, you will stay where you are, and God forbid you might regress.
This is where A Allawi.
Yes.
Every stage you seek Allah's help to achieve.
Sometimes I feel
Hassan, I think you should sit here.
No.
No, I will insist you sit here.
Thank you very much for a lovely.
No, please.
Thank you.
fascinating. Can we open the next one so that we can come?
I don't know if you'd like to continue. There's an announcement to make. Can you make it?
Please, if you could.
Apparently, the next 2 Saturdays, this venue will not be available. There's a questionnaire that Agha Mustafa has. There's some tea and coffee if you'd like some, and you can have a copy of the first discourses which I have.
Can I just make a comment? I think it's really what you said about the hierarchy aspect is really helpful, because to me I found it so interesting reading a description of these sort of different stages, and it sort of seems to me obvious that there is a kind of hierarchy, there's a progression, there is a journey, and also that you have to be loose within it. And I find it really nice, but also what I was wondering is, you were saying that there aren't many of these types of kind of, manuals or whatever. And I wonder why it is, because, I don't know what your feeling is about that, because my sense is it would be so useful for, enlightened beings to kind of have these kind of mappings.
Well, this is what I hope to be able to do. I mean, this to me is not. I mean, as I said, this is not a course on 13th century Sufism. This is an attempt to create a usable manual for those who are travelers. Yeah. Now, whatever feedback, whatever model that emerges as a result of these exchanges, I think, hopefully this will lead to some kind of book or something, or some kind of, at least, notes that are available to people. But it requires interaction. It requires people to step up and see what they think about it.
Because I was just thinking that from my own perspective, that whole thing about having some sense of recognition of what the terrain is, and the other thing that struck me from these stages is, in a sense, choosing to go by what's more subtle inwardly rather than habits or kind of what's really pressing outwardly. I mean, the language sounds, I don't really like it because it sort of sometimes to me it feels like it gets in the way. And even when I'm reading these, and
I tried to make them more
contemporary,
yes.
but it's just still I kind of. But I think I suppose I'm just trying to think of sort of if I was to talk about examples, it would be that understanding that this is a more subtle, light-filled direction, and kind of moving towards that, even though it might be a bit more difficult, or it might feel subtle or kind of not quite graspable or tangible, and leaving behind maybe what's more obvious or has immediate gratification, or I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of
Would you like to break for tea?
Yes, thank you.